He just wanted a new house, but found an unforgettable love on his first visit. Hello, let's start another beautiful story. Welcome to my channel. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Let's go. George Cole's Italian leather shoes clicked against the marble floor of his corner office, each step a metronome marking his success. Through floor-to-ceiling windows, Manhattan's skyline stretched before him like a kingdom of glass and steel. His kingdom, as of this morning's promotion announcement. He paused at the window, adjusting his already perfect Windsor knot by habit. 48 stories below, yellow cabs crawled like insects, carrying people to their ordinary lives. George had never been ordinary. And now, at 35, he was about to become the youngest CEO in Morrison & Reed's history. "Mr. Cole," his assistant's voice crackled through the intercom. "Your girlfriend is on line 1. She says it's about the house hunting." George suppressed a sigh. Claire had been pushing for them to move in together, packaging it as the next logical step in their 2-year relationship. Everything with Claire was logical, calculated, perfect on paper, just like him. "Put her through," he said, reaching for his phone. "Darling, I've found it." Claire's voice carried the precise enthusiasm of a news anchor. "The perfect property in Westchester County. Modern, minimalist, 7,000 square feet. The realtor says it's not even on the market yet." George's lips curved into a practiced smile. "Actually, I've already scheduled a viewing for this afternoon. Different property." "Oh." The slight edge in Claire's voice was familiar. She hated not being the first to know things, not being in control. "Where?" "It's a surprise." George knew this would irritate her more, but he needed space to think. The truth was, he'd found the listing by accident, a historic mansion in Riverdale, nothing like the ultra-modern properties they usually considered. Something about it had caught his eye, though he couldn't explain why. "I'll tell you all about it over dinner tomorrow." "Tomorrow? But I thought we were celebrating your promotion tonight at Le Bernardin. I already made reservations. Something came up with the Anderson development. Rain check." The lie came easily. George had built his career on knowing exactly what people wanted to hear, when to push, when to retreat. After ending the call, George stood at his window again, his empire spread before him. He should have felt triumphant. Instead, a strange restlessness itched under his skin, like a splinter he couldn't quite reach. His father's words from their last conversation echoed in his mind. "You've built yourself a perfect cage, son." George had dismissed it as the ramblings of a bitter old man who'd never understood ambition. Now, standing in his perfect office, wearing his perfect suit, about to view another perfect property, the words returned like a ghost's whisper. The car service was waiting when George left the office. His driver, Ramon, had worked for him long enough to know not to attempt conversation. George used the ride to review the property details on his tablet. Built in 1898, Victorian architecture. Original hardwood floors, 5 bedrooms, 3 acres of land. The listing photos showed rooms full of warm woods and intricate details, everything he typically avoided. The car turned onto a tree-lined street that seemed to exist in a different century. Mature oaks formed a canopy overhead, their leaves casting dappled shadows on the pavement. As they approached the address, George's practiced indifference faltered. The house rose before them like something from a forgotten dream. Warm red brick climbed 3 stories, crowned by a slate roof with elegant dormers. A wraparound porch supported by white columns invited approach, while tall windows gazed out like knowing eyes. It wasn't perfect. There were signs of age, wear, life lived, but something about it made George's chest tighten. A woman stood waiting on the porch, her dark hair caught by the afternoon breeze. She wore a simple blue dress that seemed to belong to the house's era, though it was clearly modern. As George approached, she smiled, not the practiced smile of his world, but something real and warm that reached her eyes. "Mr. Cole, I'm Cora Bennett." She extended her hand, and when George took it, something electric passed between them. Her hand was warm, slightly calloused, a hand that did real work, that touched life directly. Welcome to Oakwood House. George found himself struggling to maintain his usual professional distance. There was something in her eyes, a depth, a story, a challenge. She wasn't beautiful in the polished way Claire was beautiful. This was something else entirely, something that made his carefully constructed world feel suddenly fragile. "Shall we begin the tour?" Cora asked, producing an old brass key from her pocket. The key caught the sunlight, glinting like a promise or a warning. George nodded, following her up the porch steps. The wood creaked beneath his expensive shoes, and for the first time in years he felt like an intruder in his perfectly tailored suit. As Cora unlocked the heavy wooden door, he caught a scent of lemon polish and old wood, of time and memory and something else he couldn't name. "Welcome to my home," Cora said softly, then quickly corrected herself. "The home, I mean. Please, come in." That small slip, the hint of personal connection, caught George's attention. As he stepped across the threshold, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was crossing more than just a physical boundary. The perfect property he'd come to evaluate was already becoming something else entirely, a door opening to a part of himself he'd long ago locked away. The foyer's hardwood floors gleamed with generations of care, each board telling its own story through knots and grain patterns. George found himself removing his shoes without being asked, surprising both himself and Cora, whose slight smile didn't go unnoticed. "The original oak," she said, kneeling to trace a finger along one board's edge. "My father used to say, you could feel the whole house's history in these floors." She caught herself again, that professional mask slipping back into place. "The previous owners, I mean." George watched her recovery with growing curiosity. "You seem to know a lot about this house." "I specialize in historic properties," Cora replied, standing and smoothing her dress. "Each one has its own personality, its own rhythm. This one," she paused, looking around the space with unmistakable affection. "This one's special." They moved through the first floor, Cora pointing out original features with a curator's pride. Crown moldings hand-carved by 19th century craftsmen, brass hardware that had never been replaced, window seats where afternoon light painted patterns on worn cushions. George found himself paying less attention to the property's potential value and more to the way Cora's eyes lit up with each detail she shared. "The library is through here," she said, pushing open a set of pocket doors that slid aside with well-oiled precision. "Most buyers want to convert these spaces into home theaters or gaming rooms, but—" She didn't finish the thought. She didn't have to. The library spoke for itself, floor-to-ceiling bookcases in rich mahogany, a rolling ladder that begged to be climbed, and a bay window with a view of the gardens. A leather armchair sat in one corner, its cushions bearing the impression of countless hours of use. "Someone loved this room," George said quietly, surprising himself with the observation. Cora's eyes met his, something unspoken passing between them. "Yes," she said softly. They did. As they climbed the main staircase, their footsteps echoing against the walls, George noticed photographs he'd missed in the listing. Family gatherings spanning decades, children growing older between frames, celebrations and quiet moments frozen in time. "The current owners?" he asked, pausing at a photo of a young girl in a blue dress, sitting on the porch swing with an older man. Cora hesitated. "My family," she admitted finally. "And I've been trying to maintain professional distance, but this was my home. Still is, technically. After my father passed last year, it became clear that maintaining a house this size alone wasn't practical." The confession hung in the air between them. George studied her face, seeing now the grief hidden beneath her professional demeanor. He thought of his own father, still very much alive but equally absent, living in their family's Manhattan penthouse, surrounded by evidence of success but little proof of life. "I'm sorry," he said, the words feeling inadequate but sincere. "Don't be," Cora smiled, though her eyes glistened. "Houses like this are meant to be lived in, to shelter new stories. That's what Dad always said." She took a deep breath. "Shall we continue to the master suite?" The second floor revealed more of the house's character, guest rooms with distinct personalities, a sitting room that caught the afternoon light perfectly, and finally, the master bedroom. Here, Cora grew quieter, letting George explore on his own. He walked to the windows, taking in the view of the grounds. Old trees dotted the landscape, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. A stone path wound through what must have once been carefully tended gardens, now slightly wild, but somehow more beautiful for it. "The roof needs work," Cora said, her professional voice returning, "and the kitchen's original to the 1950s. Most buyers want to modernize completely, maybe remove some walls for an open concept." "What would you do?" George asked, turning to face her, "if money weren't an issue?" The question caught her off guard. She moved to the window beside him, their shoulders almost touching. "I'd restore it," she said finally. "Keep its soul intact while giving it the care it needs. These old houses, they don't need to be completely transformed to be beautiful. They just need someone to love them as they are." George felt the weight of her words, sensing they weren't just talking about the house anymore. In his pocket, his phone buzzed, probably Claire, wanting to know about the property. He ignored it. "There's something else I should show you," Cora said, moving toward a door he'd assumed was a closet. "The previous owners, my parents, they always said this was the heart of the house." She opened the door to reveal a hidden study, smaller than the library but somehow more intimate. A roll-top desk dominated one corner, its surface covered in papers and old books. Shelves lined the walls, but these held personal items rather than just books. Photographs, small sculptures, pieces of life collected over time. "Dad spent most of his time here," Cora explained, running her fingers along the desk's edge. "He was a writer, said he could feel the house's stories here most strongly." George approached the desk, drawn by an open notebook filled with elegant handwriting. Before he could read any words, Cora closed it gently. "Sorry," she said, "force of habit. We should probably head back downstairs. I'm sure you have other properties to view today." But George didn't move. Instead, he looked around the room again, seeing it with new eyes. In his world of glass and steel, everything was designed to impress, to project success and power. This room was different. It felt real. "Actually," he said, "I'd like to hear more about your father's stories, if you're willing to share them." Cora's surprise was visible, but beneath it, George caught a glimmer of hope, or perhaps that was just his own reflection in her eyes. Le Bernardin's soft lighting couldn't mask Claire's irritation. She sat across from George, perfectly poised in a black Chanel dress, her diamond tennis bracelet catching the light with each precise movement. It was the following evening, their rescheduled celebration dinner, but George's mind kept drifting back to worn hardwood floors and hidden studies. "You're distracted," Claire noted, setting down her wineglass with deliberate care. "Is it the Anderson development?" George blinked, pulling himself back to the present. "No, the development's fine. I was thinking about the house." Claire's interest sharpened. "Finally, tell me everything. Square footage, smart home features. Did you make an offer?" "It's different from what we discussed." George chose his words carefully, remembering Cora's fingers tracing the grain of the oak floors. "It's a Victorian, original features. Lots of character." "A Victorian?" Claire's laugh drew glances from nearby diners. "You're joking. George Cole doesn't do character. You do clean lines and modern amenities. Remember the penthouse we looked at in Tribeca? Maybe it's time for something different." The words came out before he could stop them. Claire studied him over the rim of her wineglass. "This isn't like you. A promotion should mean moving forward, not backward into some dusty old house. What aren't you telling me?" The truth was, George had barely slept last night. After leaving Oakwood House, he'd returned to his sleek downtown apartment, but everything had seemed cold, sterile. He'd spent hours at his computer, researching the property's history, looking up restoration specialists, even reading about Victorian architecture. At 3 a.m., he'd caught himself scrolling through historical photos of the neighborhood, trying to glimpse the house in its early days. The realtor, Claire said suddenly, her tone knowing. Let me guess. Young, pretty, probably acted like the house was something special. George's jaw tightened. Her name is Cora Bennett. And yes, the house is special. It's been in her family for generations. Oh, perfect. Claire's smile didn't reach her eyes. So not only is it a complete departure from everything we've planned, but it comes with emotional baggage. Do you really want to deal with a seller who's emotionally invested? You should see it, George said, though he immediately regretted the suggestion. The thought of Claire's critical gaze sweeping through those rooms, dismissing every detail that made them unique, made him inexplicably protective. I think I've seen enough already, Claire signaled for the check. Look, darling, I know the promotion is a big change, but this isn't you. The George Cole I know would never consider living in some outdated relic. That was the problem, George realized. The George Cole she knew, the one everyone knew, was feeling less and less real with each passing hour. I made an offer, he said quietly. Claire's hand froze halfway to her water glass. You what? This morning. Full asking price. Minimal conditions. He hadn't planned to tell her like this. Hadn't really planned to tell her at all yet. It felt right. Without consulting me. Without even letting me see it. Claire's voice remained perfectly modulated, but her fingers whitened around her glass. We're supposed to be building a life together, George. Making decisions together. Are we? The question surprised them both. Look at us, Claire. We're celebrating my promotion at the same restaurant where we had our first date, ordering the same wines, making the same small talk. Don't you ever want something real? Real? She laughed, but it sounded brittle. What's more real than this? We make sense together. Everyone says so. That's exactly my point. George loosened his tie, another crack in his perfect facade. We look good on paper, the power couple everyone expects us to be. But when was the last time we surprised each other? When was the last time we felt actually alive? The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken truths. Around them, other diners continued their conversations. Crystal glasses clinked, waiters glided past with elaborate dishes. Their perfect world continued spinning, but something fundamental had shifted. This isn't about the house, Claire said finally. Is it? Before George could respond, his phone buzzed. Cora's name appeared on the screen, and his heart jumped in a way it never had for Claire's calls. You need to get this out of your system, Claire said, standing and gathering her things. Call me when you remember who you are. George watched her leave, her heels clicking against the restaurant's floor like his own footsteps in his office. He should have felt panic, watching 2 years of carefully planned future walking away. Instead, he felt something closer to relief. He waited until he was outside to check Cora's message. The night air was warm, carrying the first hints of summer. Around him, the city hummed with its usual energy. But for the first time in years, he felt out of sync with its rhythm. Your offer was generous, Cora's text read. But I need to be transparent about something. Can we meet tomorrow? There's more to the house's story you should know. George looked up at the city skyline, his kingdom, as he'd thought of it just yesterday. From here, he could see his office building, still lit up despite the late hour. His perfect life waited there, the promotion, the expectations, the endless climb toward a summit that kept moving higher. Name the time and place, he typed back, then added, preferably somewhere with real coffee, not the overpriced kind. Her response came quickly. There's a small place near the house. Nothing fancy, but they make a decent cup. 10 a.m. I'll be there, he replied, already knowing he'd be cancelling his morning meetings. As he waited for his car, George realized he was smiling, not his practiced, professional smile, but something genuine and slightly uncertain. His phone buzzed again, this time with a message from Claire. When you're done playing house in the suburbs, your real life will be waiting. George slipped the phone back into his pocket without responding. For the first time in his adult life, he wasn't sure what his real life was anymore, but he was starting to suspect it might be found in the very place he'd least expected to look. The Coffee Bean was nothing like the sleek espresso bars that dotted Manhattan's financial district. Mismatched armchairs clustered around scarred wooden tables, and local art covered the walls. The morning light streamed through large windows, catching dust motes that danced in the air like tiny stars. George arrived 15 minutes early, having swapped his usual suit for dark jeans and a grey cashmere sweater. He felt oddly vulnerable without his corporate armor, but something told him this conversation called for authenticity rather than authority. Cora was already there, tucked into a corner chair with a book open on her lap. She wore a vintage-style dress in deep green, her hair loose around her shoulders. The sight of her sent an unexpected warmth through his chest. "You're early," she said, looking up with a smile that faded slightly when she saw his expression. "And you haven't slept. That obvious?" George settled into the chair across from her, noting the two steaming mugs already on the table between them. "I ordered for you," she said. "Black coffee. No sugar. You seem like a purist." He took a sip, surprised by the rich, complex flavor. "This is good. Local roaster. Dad used to say the best things in life are usually found off the beaten path." Cora closed her book, something leather-bound and well-worn, and set it aside. "Thank you for meeting me. Your message sounded important." Cora nodded, wrapping her hands around her own mug. "Before we go any further with the sale, there's something you need to know about Oakwood House, something that wasn't in the listing." George leaned forward, noting the tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers tightened around the ceramic. "The house isn't just historic," she continued. "It's protected. There's a preservation covenant that runs with the deed. Any changes to the original structure or significant architectural features must be approved by the local preservation board. Which means no major renovations," George said, understanding dawning. "No modernization. No tearing down walls for open concepts, no replacing the original windows, no significant alterations to the facade or interior architectural elements." Cora met his gaze directly. "Yeah, I should have told you this during the showing. But you surprised me." A faint blush colored her cheeks. "The way you looked at the house, how you noticed the details. I've shown Oakwood to dozens of potential buyers, and they all saw it as a problem to be solved. You saw it differently." George thought about the hidden study, the worn leather chair, the stories etched into every surface. "It deserves to be preserved." Relief flooded Cora's face. "Yes, exactly, but I need to be sure you understand what you're getting into. This isn't just a property investment. It's a commitment to being a steward of history, like your father was." The question hung between them, heavy with meaning. Cora's eyes dropped to her coffee. "Dad believed old houses choose their owners," she said softly. "He used to tell me that Oakwood found our family, not the other way around. When he got sick," she paused, collecting herself. "His last coherent conversation was about the house. He made me promise to find someone who would love it properly." "Is that why you're selling? A promise to him?" Cora shook her head. "I'm selling because keeping it feels like living in a museum of memories. Every room echoes with conversations I can't have anymore. Every corner holds a moment I can't get back." She looked up, her eyes bright with unshed tears. But I can't bear the thought of someone destroying what made it special." Without thinking, George reached across the table and covered her hand with his. Her skin was warm from the coffee mug, and he felt a slight tremor in her fingers. "Show me," he said. "Show you what? Show me everything that needs to be preserved. Every detail, every story. Help me understand the house the way you do." Cora stared at their joined hands, then back at his face. "Are you serious?" "Completely." George surprised himself with the certainty in his voice. "I made that offer because something about the house felt right. Now I know why. It's not just a property. It's a legacy." A slow smile spread across Cora's face, transforming her features. "You really are nothing like your reputation, are you?" "My reputation?" "The ruthless developer. The man who turned half of Brooklyn's historic warehouses into luxury condos." She turned her hand under his, their fingers intertwining naturally. The papers call you the modernizer. George winced. That was the old me, or maybe just the me everyone expected me to be. And who are you now? The question should have been difficult. His entire identity had been built around success, achievement, forward momentum. But sitting here, holding hands with a woman who valued history over profit, who saw beauty in imperfection, the answer felt surprisingly simple. Someone who's ready to learn a new way of seeing things. A comfortable silence settled between them, broken only by the quiet bustle of the coffee shop. Outside, the morning sun painted the street in shades of gold, and somewhere in the distance, church bells chimed the hour. "I should warn you," Cora said finally, though she didn't withdraw her hand. "There's one more thing about the house, something even stranger than the preservation covenant. Let me guess, it's haunted." She laughed, the sound bright and genuine. "No, nothing like that, but there's a room we didn't see during the showing, Dad's other study, the one in the East Wing. It's easier to show you than explain." "Now," Cora nodded, "if you're free, and if you're sure you want to know all of Oakwood's secrets." George thought about his cancelled meetings, about Claire's message still unanswered on his phone, about the life he'd spent decades building. All of it seemed less real than this moment, less important than the mystery waiting in an old house's hidden room. "Lead the way," he said, and the smile Cora gave him felt like stepping into sunlight after a long winter. The morning sun had burned away the last traces of dawn mist by the time they reached Oakwood House. George followed Cora up the front path, noticing details he'd missed during his first visit. The subtle pattern in the brick walkway, the intricate metalwork of the porch railings, the way the morning light played through the stained glass transom above the door. "The East Wing is through here," Cora said once they were inside, leading him past the main staircase toward a narrow hallway he hadn't noticed before. "Dad kept this part of the house private. Even when we had guests, this area was off limits." The hallway felt different from the rest of the house, darker, more intimate. The wallpaper here was a deep burgundy with a subtle pattern that seemed to shift in the shadows. Their footsteps were muffled by a worn oriental runner, its colors faded to beautiful, muted tones. "I always thought it was just his private writing space," Cora continued, her voice dropping to match the hushed atmosphere. "But after he died, when I started going through his papers," she stopped at a heavy oak door, her hand resting on the brass knob. "Maybe it's better if you see for yourself." The door opened with a soft creak. George's first impression was of light, golden morning sunlight streaming through tall windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny constellations. But as his eyes adjusted, he began to notice the room's true nature. Every wall was covered in photographs, documents, and maps, all connected by red strings that crisscrossed the space like a spider's web. In the center stood a massive oak table, its surface buried under stacks of leather-bound journals and yellowed papers. A vintage typewriter sat in one corner, a half-finished page still rolled in its carriage. "Your father was researching something," George said, moving closer to examine the nearest wall. The photographs spanned decades, some in color, others in sepia tones that spoke of another century entirely. Many showed Oakwood House in different seasons, different eras. Not just researching, Cora closed the door behind them. He was documenting patterns. "Look closer at the photos." George leaned in, studying a black and white image from what appeared to be the 1920s. It showed a couple on the front porch, a man in a three-piece suit, a woman in a long dress. Something about their posture, the way they looked at each other. "Now look at this one," Cora said, pointing to a color photograph from the 1970s. Different couple, same porch, same undeniable connection. And this, a Polaroid from the 1980s. Another couple, another moment of captured intimacy. "They're all love stories," George realized, seeing the pattern emerge. Dozens of couples across nearly a century, all photographed at Oakwood House, all sharing that same look of profound connection. Dad became obsessed with it after Mom died. Cora moved to the oak table, picking up one of the journals. He started tracking every owner, every significant relationship that blossomed here. He was convinced the house itself had some kind of influence. Influence. Cora opened the journal, her fingers tracing her father's elegant handwriting. He believed Oakwood House had a way of bringing together people who needed each other, not just random romances, but deeply transformative connections. Look at this. She handed him the journal, open to a page filled with dates and names. Next to each entry were notes about profound life changes, career shifts, spiritual awakenings, artistic breakthroughs. Every couple who lived here experienced some kind of transformation, Cora explained. Often, one partner was stuck in a life that didn't fit them anymore. The house, somehow, led them to someone who helped them find their true path. George felt a chill run down his spine, remembering his own inexplicable draw to the property, the immediate connection he'd felt with Cora. You don't actually believe that the house is some kind of mystical matchmaker? Cora smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. I used to think Dad's theory was just grief talking, a way to make sense of losing Mom. But then I started reading the journals, looking at the evidence he'd gathered, and she trailed off, moving to one of the windows. The morning light caught her profile, and George was struck again by how different she was from anyone in his carefully curated world. And, he prompted softly, and I started noticing things, the way certain rooms feel warmer when particular people enter them, how conversations flow differently here than anywhere else. The dreams, Cora turned back to face him. People who sleep here often report the same dream, walking through the house's rooms, but finding doors that lead to moments in their past, moments where they made choices that shaped their lives. Dad called them decision doors. George thought of his own restless night after first seeing the house, the way his carefully constructed certainties had begun to crumble. Is that why you're really selling? Because you're afraid of what the house might be trying to tell you? The question hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken implications. Cora's hands twisted together, a rare show of nervous energy. I'm selling because I need to know if what happens here is real, she said finally. If these connections, these transformations, can happen without my family's influence, without our belief making it true. And if they are real, George asked, taking a step closer to her, what then? Cora met his gaze, and in her eyes he saw the same mix of hope and fear he felt in his own heart. Then I have to accept that some things can't be explained by logic or reason, that sometimes the most important turns in our lives come disguised as simple real estate transactions. The morning light shifted, casting new shadows across the room's web of connections and coincidences. George looked again at the photographs on the walls, all those couples, all those moments of recognition and change, then back at Cora, standing in a shaft of sunlight, offering him a glimpse of something he'd never believed in until now. Show me the decision doors, he said quietly. I want to understand everything. Cora's eyes widened slightly, but she nodded. Are you sure? Once you start seeing the patterns, you can't unsee them. George thought of his perfect apartment downtown, of Claire and their carefully planned future, of the life he'd built on foundations of control and certainty. Then he thought of oak floors that held generations of stories, of hidden rooms full of mysteries, and of the woman before him who seemed to bridge both worlds. I'm sure, he said, and somehow the words felt like both an ending and a beginning. The guest room is the most consistent trigger, Cora explained, leading George up the main staircase. Dad's journals suggest it has something to do with the room's position in relation to the sunrise. Or maybe just the energy of hundreds of visitors carrying their own stories into the space. The room in question was smaller than the others, tucked into the house's eastern corner. Afternoon light hadn't yet reached its windows, leaving it in a kind of perpetual dawn. A single bed with a hand-stitched quilt occupied one corner, while a Victorian fainting couch sat beneath the window. People usually experience the dreams during afternoon naps, Cora continued, her professional mask slipping as excitement crept into her voice. Something about the light at that hour. George checked his watch, just past noon. Convenient timing. We don't have to do this, Cora said quickly. The dreams can be intense. Dad wrote about people facing moments they'd spent years trying to forget. George sat on the edge of the fainting couch, feeling the weight of the day's revelations. His phone buzzed in his pocket, probably his assistant wondering why he'd cancelled all his meetings, or Claire, still waiting for him to come to his senses. He switched it off without checking. "Tell me about your first experience with the doors," he said. Cora settled beside him on the couch, leaving careful space between them. "It was right after Mom died. I was 18, had just gotten accepted to Yale's architecture program. Dad was so proud, but Mom—" She twisted her hands in her lap. "Mom always said I was meant for something else. The night after her funeral, I fell asleep in this room and dreamed about the day I chose my college major. What happened? In the dream, I opened my bedroom door and stepped into my high school art studio instead. I was working on this incredible watercolor of Oakwood House. In reality, I'd thrown that painting away, convinced myself that art wasn't a practical career choice. But in the dream, I got to see how that path might have felt. Did it change your decision?" "I still went to Yale," Cora said with a small smile. "But I started painting again, found a way to blend both worlds. The doors don't change our past. They just help us understand our choices better." George nodded, feeling the couch's soft upholstery beneath his fingers, the weight of the air around them. "What do I do?" "Just rest." "Let the house do the rest." Cora stood, her hand brushing his shoulder briefly. "I'll be downstairs. Some people prefer to process the experience alone." After she left, George reclined on the couch, watching dust motes dance in the dim light. The house creaked and settled around him, its aged wood expanding in the growing warmth of the day. Despite his racing thoughts, his eyelids grew heavy. The last thing he saw before drifting off was a shaft of light creeping across the hardwood floor, like a path leading into memory. He opened his eyes to find himself in Oakwood's main hallway, but something was different. The wallpaper was crisper, its pattern more vibrant. A door stood open at the end of the hall, his father's study door from their old house in Manhattan. George's feet carried him forward without conscious decision. The door swung wider as he approached, revealing a scene from 20 years ago, himself at 15, standing before his father's massive desk. "Banking or law," his father was saying, not looking up from his papers. "Those are your options, George. The Cole name means something in this city. We don't waste time on frivolous pursuits." Young George clutched a brochure in his hands, some summer photography program he'd been desperate to attend. In reality, he'd tucked the brochure away and chosen banking, setting himself on the path to becoming exactly what his father wanted. But now, watching from the doorway, he saw something he'd missed back then, the way his father's hands trembled slightly as he dismissed his son's dreams, the photo on his desk of a much younger version of himself holding a guitar. The scene dissolved, reforming into another door, the entrance to his first apartment after college. Inside, he watched himself end things with Anna, his college girlfriend who'd wanted to travel, to experience life before settling into careers. "We have to be practical," his younger self was saying. "Long distance never works, and this opportunity at Morrison and Reed." But now he could see what he'd been blind to then. The way Anna looked at him with not just sadness but recognition, as if she were watching someone disappear beneath a mask of expectations. More doors appeared, each leading to moments where he'd chosen security over passion, appearance over authenticity. The day he'd first met Claire at a charity gala, both of them performing the roles expected of them. The morning he'd approved the demolition of his first historic building, ignoring the protests of local artists who'd made it their home. The final door opened onto yesterday's dinner at Le Bernardin. But this time, he was outside himself, watching the scene unfold from a new angle. He saw the way Claire's perfect posture was really armor, how both of them had built cages of success and called them home. "We make sense together," Dream Claire was saying again. "Everyone says so. But when was the last time we felt actually alive?" The words echoed differently now, carrying the weight of all the doors that had led him here. George felt something shift inside him, like a key turning in a lock he hadn't known existed. He woke with a gasp, afternoon light now flooding the guest room. His cheeks were wet, though he couldn't remember crying. Outside the window, a pair of cardinals darted between tree branches, their red feathers bright against the green leaves. George sat up slowly, his body heavy with more than just sleep. Every choice that had shaped him into the man he'd become felt present in his mind, not as regrets exactly, but as lessons finally understood. The floorboards creaked behind him. He turned to find Cora in the doorway, holding 2 cups of tea, her face full of gentle concern. "How long was I asleep?" he asked, his voice rough. "About 2 hours." She crossed the room and sat beside him, closer this time, offering one of the cups. "Do you want to talk about it?" George took the tea, letting its warmth ground him in the present moment. "I saw all the doors I closed, all the times I chose to become someone else's version of myself." Cora's free hand found his, their fingers intertwining naturally. And now, he looked at her, really looked at her, seeing how the afternoon light caught the auburn highlights in her hair, the tiny freckle near her left eye, the way she held herself open to whatever truth he needed to share. "Now I think I understand what your father meant about the house choosing its owners." George squeezed her hand gently. "Some doors need to close so others can open." Around them, Oakwood House creaked and settled, its walls holding centuries of similar revelations, its rooms waiting for whatever transformations might come next. Through the window, the cardinals had begun building a nest in the old oak tree, weaving new life from forgotten things. The late afternoon sun painted Oakwood's garden in shades of honey and gold. George stood at the kitchen window, watching shadows stretch across the overgrown flower beds, while Cora moved around the old-fashioned space, preparing something that filled the air with the scent of herbs and comfort. "Mum's recipe," she explained, stirring a pot of soup. "She always said food made in this kitchen tasted better than anywhere else. Something about the energy of all the families who'd cooked here before." After his experience with the decision doors, George found it harder to dismiss such notions. The kitchen's worn surfaces seemed to hum with accumulated memories. Generations of Sunday dinners, midnight snacks, quiet conversations over coffee. "My mother never cooked," he said, surprising himself with the admission. "We had staff for that, even on holidays." Cora glanced at him over her shoulder. And now I have a professional meal service that delivers perfectly portioned, Instagram-worthy dishes to my door." He laughed softly. God, saying it out loud. "Hey!" Cora abandoned her stirring and moved to stand beside him. "No judging past choices, remember, that's not what the doors are for." Their shoulders touched, and George felt that now familiar spark of connection. Since waking from his dream journey, everything felt more immediate, more real, especially Cora's presence. His phone buzzed again in his pocket. He turned it back on to find 17 missed calls. His assistant, his board members, Claire. The real world wouldn't wait forever. "I should check in at the office," he said reluctantly. "Use Dad's study," Cora offered. "The one we saw yesterday, not the other one. Better reception there." The study felt different in the late afternoon light. Yesterday's imposing shadows had softened, revealing worn leather chairs that invited contemplation. George settled behind the desk, its surface still scattered with Mr. Bennet's papers, and began returning calls. "George, finally!" His assistant's voice was tightly controlled. "The board is asking questions." "The Anderson development meeting. Reschedule it," George interrupted, his eyes falling on one of Mr. Bennet's journals. "And send me the latest preservation codes for Riverdale. All of them. Preservation codes. But the Anderson project is all new construction. It's for something else. A personal project." There was a pause. "Claire called several times. She said to remind you about the Cooper wedding this weekend. Your tux fitting. Cancel it." George traced the spine of the journal, feeling the texture of its aged leather. "In fact, clear my social calendar for the next few weeks, and get me a meeting with the Historical Society." "The Historical? George, are you feeling all right?" He looked out the study window at the garden where Cora had appeared, kneeling among the overgrown beds, her hands in the earth. She'd changed into jeans and an old t-shirt, her hair tied back messily, looking more real than anyone he'd seen at last month's charity gala. "I'm feeling more all right than I have in years," he said honestly. "Email me those codes as soon as you can." The next call was harder. "I thought you'd lost your mind," Claire said without preamble. "But this is worse. You're having a midlife crisis." "I'm 35. Fine, an early midlife crisis." "The board is talking, George. This isn't like you, disappearing in the middle of the week, missing meetings, cancelling appointments." Through the window, he watched Cora unearth something from the garden. An old stone border by the look of it, long hidden beneath years of neglect. "Maybe that's the point," he said quietly. "Maybe it's time to figure out who I really am, not who everyone expects me to be." Claire's laugh was sharp. "Oh, and I suppose this journey of self-discovery has nothing to do with the realtor." George's silence was apparently answer enough. "Oh, George." Claire's voice softened with something like pity. "When you're done playing house in the suburbs with your manic pixie dream girl, don't expect everything to be waiting exactly as you left it. Actions have consequences." "I know." He watched Cora stand, brushing dirt from her jeans, pride evident in her stance as she surveyed the uncovered stonework. "That's exactly what I'm counting on." After ending the call, George sat in the growing dusk, letting the study wrap him in its peaceful atmosphere. The house creaked and settled around him, its sounds no longer strange but comforting, like a conversation he was slowly learning to understand. A soft knock drew his attention. Cora stood in the doorway, smudges of dirt on her face, looking impossibly beautiful in the fading light. "Soup's ready," she said, "and I found something in the garden you should see." "The stone border." "That too. But this is different." She held up a small, dirt-encrusted object. It was buried near the roses. I think it might have belonged to one of the couples from Dad's research." George joined her, taking the object carefully. Beneath the dirt, metal gleamed, a pocket watch, its case intricately engraved. "There's an inscription," Cora said, leading him back to the kitchen where better light still streamed through western windows. "But it's too dirty to read." They cleaned it together at the old sink, their hands brushing in the warm water. As the dirt washed away, words emerged on the watch's silver surface. "To remember time is precious, but love is timeless." June 1922. Cora read the date beneath the inscription. "Wait!" She hurried to the other study, returning with one of her father's journals. Here, June 1922, William and Catherine Porter. He was a businessman who gave up his family's banking empire to become a watchmaker. "She was a gardener," George finished, something clicking into place. "The roses, they're not just random plantings, are they?" Cora shook her head, excitement building in her voice. "Each owner added something to the garden. Mom used to tell me stories about it, but I always thought she was just being romantic. The roses, the herb garden, the stone borders, they're all pieces of different love stories." George looked down at the watch, then back at Cora. In the warm kitchen light, with dirt still smudging her cheek and her eyes bright with discovery, she was the most real thing he'd ever seen. "I need to show you something," he said. "My own addition to the house's story." He pulled out his tablet, opening the email his assistant had just sent. Preservation codes, historical renovation guidelines, grant applications for historical restoration. "I've been doing research since I woke up." Cora's eyes widened as she scrolled through the documents. "George, this is a commitment," he finished. "Not just to the house, but to everything it represents, every love story it holds, every transformation it's witnessed." He took a deep breath. "Including ours, if you're willing to be part of it." The watch ticked softly between them, marking the moment. Outside, the garden waited in the gathering dusk, ready for its next chapter, and in the warm light of Oakwood's kitchen, surrounded by generations of love stories, George and Cora stood on the threshold of their own. The kitchen's warmth enveloped them as Cora stared at the preservation documents on George's tablet, her fingers hovering over the screen without touching it. The pocket watch continued its steady rhythm on the counter between them, marking the weight of his words, including ours. "If you're willing to be part of it, George," she began, her voice soft but complicated. "The house doesn't just bring people together, it shows them who they really are. How do you know this version of you is real? That it's not just the magic of this place, making you see what you want to see?" Before he could answer, headlights swept across the kitchen windows. A car door slammed, followed by the sharp click of heels on the brick pathway. "Mr. Cole," a woman's voice called from the porch, "your assistant said I'd find you here." Cora tensed, recognizing the voice before George did. "Regina Warner," she whispered. "Our head of the Riverdale Historical Society." The doorbell rang, its antique chime echoing through the house. George touched Cora's arm gently. "Let me handle this." Regina Warner was everything Cora wasn't. Polished, professional, wielding authority like a weapon. Her tailored suit and perfectly styled silver hair seemed to reject the very notion of garden dirt and homemade soup. "Mr. Cole," she said, as George opened the door, "I must say, this is unexpected. When your assistant called about preservation codes..." Her eyes swept past him to where Cora stood in the kitchen doorway. "Ah, Miss Bennet. I should have known." "Mrs. Warner." Cora's voice was carefully neutral. "What brings you here so late?" "Concern, primarily." Regina stepped into the foyer, her heels clicking against the hardwood. "Dumi, when Manhattan's most aggressive developer suddenly shows interest in historical preservation, one has to wonder about motives." "My motives are simple," George said, drawing himself up to his full height. "I want to restore this house, not destroy it." Regina's laugh was elegant but cutting. "And I suppose this sudden interest in preservation has nothing to do with the charming Miss Bennet. The Historical Society remembers your work in Brooklyn, Mr. Cole. Entire neighborhoods transformed overnight, history erased for luxury condos." "People can change," Cora said quietly. "People, perhaps." Regina turned to her with something like pity. "But corporations rarely do. Did you know, Miss Bennet, that Morrison and Reed just filed permits for the Anderson development, a project that will demolish an entire block of Victorian homes much like this one?" George felt the impact of her words in Cora's sharp intake of breath. "That project was in motion before..." "Before what?" Regina pressed. "Before you discovered the romantic notion of saving one old house to win one young woman's heart. How convenient that your epiphany arrives just as Miss Bennet needs to sell her family home." The pocket watch ticked loudly in the suddenly charged atmosphere. George looked to Cora, seeing doubt creep into her eyes. "The Anderson development is different," he said. "This is personal. Everything about this is personal," Cora replied, her voice trembling slightly. "That's what makes it complicated." Regina watched their exchange with shrewd eyes. "The Historical Society is meeting tomorrow morning to discuss several properties, including this one. We've received an offer from a preservation trust interested in turning Oakwood into a museum. No renovation required, just restoration and maintenance. The house's history would be protected forever." The words landed like stones in still water, ripples of possibility disturbing everything they'd begun to build. "A museum..." George stepped toward Cora, but she moved back, wrapping her arms around herself. "It would solve everything, wouldn't it?" Her voice was distant now. "The house would be preserved, its stories protected, no need to trust in transformations or magic or..." She met his eyes. Or love stories that might not be real." "Cora, I think you both have decisions to make," Regina interrupted smoothly. "The society meets at 9. We'll need answers by then." She moved to the door, then paused. "Oh, and Mr. Cole, the board of Morrison and Reed is calling an emergency meeting tonight. Something about concerns over your recent behavior. Your assistant should have the details." After she left, the house seemed to hold its breath. George's phone buzzed. Another message about the board meeting. In the kitchen, the soup had gone cold. "You should go," Cora said finally. "The board is waiting." "What about you?" She picked up the pocket watch, its inscription catching the light. "Time is precious, but love is timeless." "I need to think," she said, "about what's real and what's just." She gestured vaguely at the house around them. "Magic and wishful thinking." "This is real," George insisted, closing the distance between them. "What I feel, what I want for this house, for us." "Is it?" Cora's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "2 days ago, you were going to tear down a neighborhood of houses just like this one. You had a life, a girlfriend, a plan. Maybe Regina's right. Maybe this is just another kind of development project for you. The returns are just emotional instead of financial." The pocket watch ticked between them, counting out moments of painful truth. Outside, the garden they'd worked in just hours ago lay in darkness, its recovered stones and ancient roses holding their secrets. "The board meeting starts in an hour," Cora said softly. "You should change before you go. You still have dirt on your hands." George looked down at his soil-stained fingers, evidence of real work, real connection to this place. Then at his phone, where messages from his old life accumulated like warnings. "Whatever I decide," he said, "it won't be about the money, or the board, or what anyone else thinks is right." "I know," Cora managed a small smile. "That's what scares me." She walked him to the door, the house creaking around them like a living thing in pain. On the porch, the night air carried the scent of roses, William and Catherine's roses, planted a century ago by another couple who'd chosen love over empire. 9 o'clock, Cora reminded him. "The Historical Society will want their answer." "And what answer do you want?" She looked past him to the garden, to the stars emerging above the old oak trees. "I want to believe that some transformations are real, that some love stories are worth the risk." Her eyes met his. But I also want to protect this house and everything it means. So maybe the real question is, what are you willing to risk to prove this is real?" George descended the porch steps into the gathering night, each step taking him closer to a choice between worlds. Behind him, Oakwood House stood silent and waiting, its windows glowing with warm light, its rooms full of stories about people who'd faced similar moments of truth. The pocket watch's inscription echoed in his mind as he walked to his car. Time is precious, but love is timeless. Now he just had to decide which was worth more, the time he'd invested in becoming George Cole, CEO, or the love that might transform him into someone else entirely. The Morrison and Reed boardroom hadn't changed, but George had. The floor-to-ceiling windows that had once made him feel like a king now seemed like walls of a terrarium, displaying specimens of corporate success in their natural habitat. 7 board members sat around the gleaming table, their expressions ranging from concern to barely concealed hostility. He hadn't changed clothes. Traces of garden soil still clung to his jeans, and his cashmere sweater carried the scent of Cora's soup. It was a deliberate choice, armor of a different kind. "George," Richard Morrison, the firm's senior partner, gestured to the empty chair at the head of the table. "We've been trying to reach you all day." "I've been busy." George remained standing, noting how Claire sat at Richard's right hand, her face a mask of professional concern. "Yes, we've heard." Richard's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Historical preservation codes, meetings with local conservation societies, and now we hear you're planning to withdraw from the Anderson development." "Not withdraw," George corrected, "modify. The Victorian homes on the site can be incorporated into the design. We can create something that honors the past while throwing away millions in potential revenue." Claire interrupted. "This isn't like you, George. Ever since you saw that house—" "Oakwood," he said quietly. "It has a name." "The house," Claire continued as if he hadn't spoken. "You've been making increasingly erratic decisions, missing meetings, cancelling appointments, and now this complete reversal on the Anderson project." Richard leaned forward, steepling his fingers. "We're worried about you, son. This sudden interest in preservation, these romantic notions about old buildings. It's not what Morrison and Reed stands for. George looked around the table, seeing his future laid out before him. More glass towers, more demolished history, more board meetings where they talked about progress while destroying the very things that gave places their soul. Maybe that's the problem, he said. A murmur went around the table. Richard's smile tightened. I beg your pardon? Maybe what Morrison and Reed stands for needs to change. George pulled out his tablet, opening the files he'd been working on since leaving Oakwood. I've drawn up proposals for a new division focusing on historical renovation and adaptive reuse. There's a growing market for authenticity, for places with character and story. Stories don't pay dividends, another board member cut in. Leave the fairy tales to Disney. We're in real estate. Real estate is about more than just property values, George insisted. It's about community, identity, the layers of life that make a place worth what? Claire stood, her perfect composure cracking. Worth throwing away everything you've worked for, worth disappointing everyone who believed in you. And for what? Some romantic fantasy about an old house and a woman you barely know. The boardroom fell silent. George felt the weight of every eye, every judgment, every expectation he'd carried for so long. You're right, he said finally. I barely know her, but I barely knew myself until I walked into that house. He turned to Richard. I'm withdrawing from the Anderson project completely, not modifying, withdrawing, and I'm stepping down as CEO. The chaos that erupted around the table washed over him without impact. Claire's face had gone pale, her hands gripping the back of her chair. Richard was shouting something about contracts and obligations. You can't just walk away, Claire said, her voice cutting through the noise. This isn't a movie, George. Real life doesn't work like that. George thought of the decision doors, of all the moments that had led him here. Actually, he said, sometimes it does. He was halfway to the door when Richard's voice stopped him. Or if you walk out now, there's no coming back. Everything you've built, everything you were meant to become. That's just it, George interrupted. I was never meant to become this. I chose it, one decision at a time, until I forgot I had any other choices. He smiled, feeling lighter with each step away from the table. But now I'm choosing something else. The Historical Society meets in the morning, Claire called after him. They'll never believe this transformation is real. Regina Warner will make sure of that. George paused at the door, thinking of the pocket watch, of William Porter, who'd walked away from his family's banking empire to become a watchmaker. Of all the couples in Mr. Bennett's photographs who'd chosen love over convention. Maybe not, he agreed. But Cora will, and that's what matters. The elevator ride to the lobby felt like descending from another world. Outside, Manhattan's lights sparkled against the night sky, but they no longer called to him like they used to. Instead, his mind was filled with warm wooden floors, hidden studies, and a garden waiting to be restored. His phone buzzed, a message from Cora. The Museum Trust wants to meet tonight. They're offering full asking price, immediate closure. Dad would have loved knowing Oakwood would be preserved forever. George looked up at the Morrison and Reed building, its glass facade reflecting the city's ambition back on itself. Then he typed, "Meet me at the house in an hour. There's something I need to show you first." Her reply came quickly. "Oh, it's late. Time is precious," he wrote back, remembering the watch's inscription. But some things are timeless." He flagged down a taxi, giving the driver Oakwood's address. As they pulled away from the curb, he didn't look back at the tower that had once been his whole world. Instead, he opened his tablet to the other set of documents he'd prepared, not preservation codes this time, but something more personal. Something that would prove, once and for all, that some transformations were worth every risk. Oakwood House looked different in the depths of night. Moonlight silvered its brick facade and cast strange shadows through the oak trees, making the familiar shapes of porch columns and gables seem somehow more ancient, more knowing. George climbed the front steps slowly, aware of every creak and whisper of the old wood beneath his feet. Cora waited in the doorway, wrapped in what looked like her father's old cardigan. The sight of her, hair loose, feet bare, completely unguarded, made his carefully prepared speech catch in his throat. "You left the board meeting," she said softly. "It wasn't a question. I left everything." He moved closer, close enough to see the conflict in her eyes. The CEO position, the Anderson project, all of it. "George, let me show you something first." He gestured to the house. Inside, she hesitated, then stepped back to let him in. The foyer was dark except for a single lamp that cast a warm pool of light around the entrance to Mr. Bennett's research study. George headed there, knowing Cora would follow. The room felt alive at night. Moonlight filtered through the windows, making the red strings connecting the photographs glow like strands of fate. The typewriter's keys gleamed dully, still holding the ghost of the last words Mr. Bennett had written. "Your father's last journal entry," George said, moving to the desk. "You never finished reading it, did you?" Cora hugged herself tighter. "I couldn't. It was too personal." George picked up the journal with careful hands. "He was writing about you." Her breath caught. "What?" "I came back this afternoon while you were meeting the museum trust. I needed to understand something about the house, about all these stories your father collected." George opened the journal to the final entry, its pages worn with time, but the handwriting still clear. He knew he was dying when he wrote this. Moonlight and lamplight mingled as George began to read. "My dearest Cora will inherit more than just a house. She'll inherit a legacy of love stories, each one proof that the extraordinary exists in our ordinary world. But she's afraid of letting go, afraid of her own story. The house knows this. It's waiting for her to understand that preserving the past doesn't mean sacrificing the future." Tears slipped down Cora's cheeks, catching the light. "Dad always said I held on too tight. There's more." George turned the page. "The house has always known what people need, even when they don't know it themselves. It led Catherine to William in 1922, showing a banker how to measure time in moments instead of money. It led Robert to Eleanor in 1957, teaching a war-hardened soldier how to find peace in a garden's quiet growth. And now, I believe, it's preparing for Cora's story." "He couldn't have known," Cora whispered, "about you, about any of this. Maybe not specifically." George set down the journal and pulled out his tablet. "But he knew something was coming. Just like I knew, the moment I walked in here, that everything was about to change." He opened a document and handed it to her. Cora's eyes widened as she read, "This is a proposal, not for the house, though that's part of it, but for a foundation, the Oakwood Foundation for Historical Preservation and Architectural Education." George stepped closer, his voice soft but intense. "Using my resources, my connections, but with a completely different purpose. We'd start here with this house, making it a living museum of sorts, not just preserving it, but using it to teach others about historical renovation, about the importance of maintaining these architectural treasures. But the Museum Trust would lock the house away behind velvet ropes. This would keep it alive, let it keep doing what it's always done, bringing people together, changing lives." He touched her hand gently. "And you wouldn't have to leave. You'd be the director, teaching others to see what you see, to love what you love." Cora stared at the proposal, her hands trembling slightly. "This is real. You'd really walk away from everything you've built to save old houses. Not just save them, transform them, like this one transformed me." George moved to the wall of photographs, touching one of the faded images. Every couple in these pictures faced a choice between safety and possibility, between what made sense and what made them feel alive. The house creaked around them, its timbers shifting in the night air like a living thing holding its breath. Through the windows, the garden waited in moonlight, William and Catherine's roses silver-tipped and ethereal. "The Historical Society meets in 7 hours, Cora said quietly. "Regina will never approve this. She'll say it's too risky, too dependent on us. Then we'll find another way. Apply for different historical designations. Work with other preservation groups." George turned back to her. "I'm not giving up on this house, Cora, or on us." She looked up from the tablet, her eyes bright with tears and something else, something like hope. "You really did it, didn't you? You chose a completely different life, just like that." "No," he said softly, "not just like that. Every moment since I walked through that door has been leading to this choice. Every story in this room, every word in your father's journals, every second I've spent with you, it's all been teaching me what really matters." Moonlight shifted as clouds moved across the night sky, making the red strings on the walls dance like living things. The typewriter's keys caught the light, reminding them of stories yet to be written. "And Dad's last entry," Cora said suddenly. "You didn't finish it." George picked up the journal again, finding the final lines. "The house knows what it's doing. It's been waiting for someone who can see beyond surface value to true worth. Someone who can help Cora write her own story, one that honors the past while embracing the future. When that person comes, the house will know, and so will she." The last word hung in the quiet room. Outside, an owl called once, its voice carrying across the moonlit garden. Cora moved to stand beside George, her hand finding his. "The Museum Trust is waiting for my answer," she whispered. "And what answer do you want to give them?" She looked around the room, at all the love stories her father had documented, at the proof that sometimes the most impossible changes were the most real. Then back at George, who had walked away from an empire to stand here in the moonlight, holding her hand and offering a different kind of future. "I want," she began, her voice growing stronger with each word, "I want our story to be on these walls someday. I want to know how it feels to choose possibility over safety. I want—" The house settled around them with a sound like a contented sigh, and in that moment they both knew what her answer would be. The Riverdale Historical Society occupied a pristine Victorian mansion that, to George's newly educated eye, felt more like a museum piece than a home. As he and Cora climbed the steps to its wraparound porch, he noted the stark difference between this preserved perfection and Oakwood's lived-in warmth. "Ready?" he asked, watching Cora smooth her dress, the same blue one she'd worn when they first met, though it felt like a lifetime ago. "No," she admitted, then smiled. But let's do it anyway." The meeting room was already full when they entered. Regina Warner sat at the head of a massive oak table, surrounded by society board members. Claire sat near the back, her presence a silent reminder of everything George had walked away from. The Museum Trust representatives occupied one side of the table, their expressions quietly confident. "Mr. Cole, Miss Bennett." Regina's voice carried the weight of institutional authority. "I understand you have a proposal." George placed his tablet on the podium, but before he could speak, Claire stood. "If I may," she said, her professional smile perfectly in place, "I think the board should know that Mr. Cole's judgment may be compromised. As of last night, he resigned his position at Morrison and Reed, abandoned multiple development projects, and effectively ended his career in mainstream real estate development." Murmurs rippled through the room. Regina's eyebrows rose. "Is this true, Mr. Cole?" "Yes," George's voice was steady, "because I finally understood what success really means." He pressed a button, and the presentation screen behind him lit up with images. William and Catherine Porter in their garden, Robert and Eleanor tending the roses after the war, dozens of couples whose lives had been transformed by Oakwood House. "These aren't just old photographs," he continued. "They're proof that some places have value beyond their market price. Each couple here faced a choice between convention and conviction, between what was expected and what was right." "Very moving," Regina interrupted. "But sentiment doesn't pay maintenance costs. The Museum Trust offers stability, guaranteed preservation." "Preservation isn't just about keeping things unchanged." Cora stepped forward, her voice stronger than George had ever heard it. "It's about keeping them alive." She took the podium, pulling up new images, sketches of classrooms filled with architecture students, workshops on historical renovation techniques, community gardens bringing new life to the grounds. The Oakwood Foundation wouldn't just preserve the house, she explained, passion making her voice ring. It would use it to teach others why preservation matters, how to blend historical integrity with modern needs, how to keep these precious places alive for future generations. With what funding? One of the museum trustees asked. These programs you're proposing would be fully endowed. George placed a document on the table. I've liquidated my personal investment portfolio. Every penny I've earned turning old buildings into glass towers, I'm putting it all into this foundation. Claire's sharp intake of breath cut through the shocked silence. You can't be serious. I've never been more serious about anything. George met Regina's calculating gaze. You said people can change, but corporations rarely do. Well, I'm not a corporation anymore. I'm just a man who finally learned to see the true value of things. Pretty words, Regina said, but the society needs more than romantic gestures. We need... The door burst open, cutting her off. A young woman hurried in, whispering urgently in Regina's ear. The society president's eyes widened. It seems, she said slowly, that news of Mr. Cole's resignation has already sparked interest. The governor's office just called. They're interested in making Oakwood House a pilot program for a new statewide historical preservation initiative. Apparently, the idea of Manhattan's most aggressive developer turning preservationist has caught their attention. The museum trustees shifted uncomfortably. Cora's hand found George's, squeezing tight. Furthermore, Regina continued, studying another message on her phone, several architecture schools have already expressed interest in partnering with this proposed foundation. It seems Mr. Cole's contacts haven't entirely abandoned him. Because they understand what we're trying to do, George said. This isn't just about one house or one couple. It's about showing that progress doesn't have to mean destruction, that the future can grow from the past instead of replacing it. He pulled out one final item, the pocket watch they'd found in the garden. Its silver surface caught the morning light streaming through the windows. Time is precious, he read the inscription, but love is timeless. William Porter wrote those words when he chose love over empire. I'm making the same choice. Regina studied them for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Finally, she turned to Cora. Your father was a dear friend, she said softly. He always said Oakwood would choose its own future. I never quite believed him until now. She straightened in her chair, authority settling back around her shoulders. The society will need to review the foundation's proposed bylaws, of course, and there will be strict oversight of any educational programs. But a slight smile touched her lips. I believe we may have found a way to preserve not just Oakwood's structure, but its spirit as well. The museum trustees began to protest, but their voices faded into background noise. George and Cora stood in their small bubble of triumph, hands clasped, hearts racing with the knowledge that they'd done it. They'd found a way to honor both the past and the future. Claire rose from her seat, approaching them with measured steps. I hope you know what you're doing, she said to George, but her voice held more resignation than bitterness. Both of you. We do, Cora answered for them both, and something in her quiet certainty made Claire pause. She studied them for a moment longer, then nodded once. Well, then, I suppose some love stories are worth the risk after all. As she left, Regina began outlining next steps, the society members clustering around to discuss details. But George and Cora barely heard them. Through the windows, they could see Oakwood's roof rising above the trees in the distance, its slate tiles gleaming in the morning sun. Ready for the real work to begin? George asked softly. Cora's smile was radiant. With you? Always. The pocket watch ticked steadily between them, marking the moment when their story officially joined the countless others in Oakwood's embrace. Another testament to the power of choosing love over empire, authenticity over expectation, and the courage to believe in transformation. 1 year later, The autumn light painted Oakwood's garden in shades of gold and amber as students from the preservation workshop carefully uncovered another section of the original stone pathway. Their excited murmurs drifted up to where George stood in Mr. Bennet's research study, watching through the window as another piece of the house's history emerged from decades of sleep. "They found something," Cora said from the doorway, her voice bright with discovery. "Another time capsule, buried near the gazebo foundation." George turned to see her holding a small copper box, tarnished with age, but still intact. She'd been teaching all morning. He could tell by the chalk dust on her dress and the slight smudge of graphite on her chin from demonstrating architectural sketching techniques. "William and Catherine's?" he asked, moving to clear a space on the old desk. "Earlier, I think. The construction suggests 1890s. She set the box down carefully. "Want to do the honors?" The lid creaked open to reveal a collection of treasures, a daguerreotype of the original family, letters tied with faded ribbon, and something that made them both catch their breath, a delicate silver key on a silk cord. "Look at the engraving," Cora whispered, lifting it carefully. "Or to unlock the future, one must first unlock the past." George smiled, remembering another key, the one Cora had used to let him into Oakwood that first day, when he'd been so certain about who he was and what he wanted. The house had changed since then, but not in the ways his old self would have imagined. The rooms still held their history, their worn floors and weathered woods telling stories of lives lived fully. But now they also buzzed with new energy. Students learning traditional crafting techniques in the converted carriage house, local artists exhibiting in the formal parlor, gardeners tending to William and Catherine's roses while learning about historical landscaping. "The first graduation ceremony is next week," Cora said, setting the key back in its box. 5 newly certified preservation specialists, ready to save more houses like this one. Your father would have loved it." "He knows," she smiled, gesturing to the wall of photographs where their own story had joined the others. George and Cora in the garden, dirty and laughing as they uncovered those first stones. The two of them at the foundation's opening, standing beneath Oakwood's iconic porch. Quiet moments caught by students and visitors who sensed something special in the way they moved through the house's rooms together. The latest addition sat in a simple silver frame, George on one knee in the restored garden, proposing with not a ring, but a key, the original key to Oakwood's front door, found hidden behind a loose brick in the kitchen hearth. "Speaking of fathers," Cora said carefully, "did you tell yours about the baby?" George's hand went automatically to the slight curve of her stomach, still barely visible beneath her dress. "Not yet, but he's coming to the graduation ceremony. Says he wants to see what was worth giving up an empire for." "And what will you tell him?" Before George could answer, voices rose from the garden. The students had fully uncovered the old path, revealing an intricate pattern of stones laid by loving hands a century ago. "I'll tell him to look around," George said softly, "to see how the past and future can grow together. How love stories don't end, they just become part of something larger." Cora moved into his arms, fitting there as naturally as if the house had designed them for each other. Through the window, autumn sunlight turned the world to gold, and the old oak trees whispered secrets to the young saplings planted beneath them. "The museum trustees visited yesterday," she murmured against his chest. "Said we're doing everything wrong, letting people touch the artifacts, holding classes in historical rooms, turning the grounds into working gardens instead of manicured displays. And I told them that's exactly the point." She pulled back to meet his eyes. "Oakwood was never meant to be a museum. It's meant to be lived in, to keep growing and changing while holding on to what matters most." As if in agreement, the house creaked gently around them, its timbers singing with memories of all the love stories it had witnessed. In the garden, the students were packing up for the day, their voices full of excitement about tomorrow's lessons on historical mortar techniques and window restoration. "I have something for you," George said, reaching into his desk drawer. He pulled out a leather-bound journal, its pages still blank and waiting. I thought, well, your father documented all those other love stories. Maybe it's time we started documenting our own. Cora took the journal, her fingers tracing its spine. For the baby. For anyone who needs to believe in transformation, in the power of choosing love over empire. He placed his hand over hers on the journal. But for anyone who needs to know that sometimes the greatest adventures start with a simple real estate transaction. She laughed, the sound echoing through the study like music. Outside, the garden lay waiting for tomorrow's lessons, its paths both old and new, leading visitors through layers of history toward whatever future they were brave enough to imagine. "Where should we begin?" Cora asked, opening the journal to its first blank page. George thought for a moment, then smiled. "How about, once there was a house that knew what people needed, even when they didn't know it themselves." The autumn light streamed through Oakwood's windows as they began to write, adding their chapter to the endless story of love and transformation that lived in the house's walls. In the garden, William and Catherine's roses bloomed one last time before winter, their petals catching the sunlight like promises kept. And somewhere, in the space between what was and what could be, Mr. Bennet smiled, knowing his beloved house had chosen well after all. The end. That was a beautiful story, wasn't it? I hope you enjoyed it. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Your collaboration is very important to me.